Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. That day, for the first time, I felt my reality beginning to unravel. The morning started as usual. The aroma of coffee filled the kitchen, and Ryan, as focused as always, stood by the kitchen island, scrolling through his tablet. His habitual aloofness had long ceased to bother me, yet something about him had changed recently. His gaze had become evasive, as though he were searching for ways to avoid me while still being nearby. In the evening, returning from the supermarket, I unloaded the bags from the trunk of his car. Everything was in its usual place: neatly packed gym bags, technical manuals on the back seat. But then, something glinted beneath the passenger seat. It was a woman's earring. Small, silver, with a tiny blue stone resembling a shard of the sky. My first thought was absurd. Perhaps the earring had fallen out of my bag, but I had never owned such jewelry. My heart tightened into a painful knot, and under the bright streetlight, I stood there trying to find a rational explanation. Whose could it be? A colleague's? A client's? A trinket of no significance? But even then, something stirred inside me, refusing to be suppressed. When I returned to the house, Ryan was already in his study. He always retreated there right after dinner, rarely finishing his glass of wine. I placed the earring on the edge of the desk by the study door. He glanced up, saw the item, and without blinking, said, "It's not mine." Too quick, too confident a response. "Really?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. "Of course." He looked away, burying himself in the screen again. "It's probably our neighbors. She sat in the car recently when I gave her a ride." The explanation sounded so plausible that I almost believed him. Almost. But a small splinter of doubt remained lodged in my chest. I said nothing more, just nodded and went to the bedroom. That evening, my stepson Eli arrived. His return was unexpected. He usually gave notice a couple of days in advance, but this time he called just an hour before showing up. The moment he stepped into the house, everything seemed to come alive. His way of communicating, his lightheartedness and energy, filled the rooms that had long been steeped in tense silence. He hugged me, jokingly commented on the lavender scent in the hallway, which he always found too homey, and kissed my cheek with a sincerity that felt like we were old friends. Dinner was the three of us. Ryan sat across from me, Eli to the side, between us. The conversation flowed smoothly until Eli dropped a cryptic remark aimed at his father. "Funny how you keep up the facade when the truth always comes out eventually." I froze. So did Ryan. The silence stretched, taut as a string ready to snap. Ryan frowned but said nothing. He simply lifted his glass, took a sip, and, setting it down, stood from the table. "I have work to do," he muttered before retreating to his study. I was left alone with Eli. His eyes gleamed with a strange curiosity, and I felt as though I were under the glare of a spotlight. "What did you mean by that?" I asked, holding his gaze. He smirked slightly, raising his fork with a piece of food. A barely perceptible tilt of his head, a look that seemed to see more than it should. "Just a thought. Dad likes to keep everything under control, but that rarely works." I didn't press further. Something in his tone reminded me of a child nursing an old wound. But this pain was beyond my understanding. I averted my eyes and got up from the table to clear the dishes. Later, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this day marked the beginning of something new. The earring, Eli's cryptic words, Ryan's evasiveness, it all formed a picture I couldn't yet decipher. But I knew one thing: there was much I needed to understand. After Saturday breakfast, Ryan suggested we all go for a walk together as a family. The sun was shining outside, and the three of us headed toward the park. Our town was cozy, with shady alleys and small cafes that always smelled of fresh pastries. Ryan walked ahead, taking work calls, while Eli and I trailed behind, chatting about trivial, lighthearted things. Eli was different. Being with him felt easy. Even when his jokes were a bit provocative, there was no malice in them. He observed the world with a patient curiosity, as though he was searching for something deeper in people than they usually revealed. "What did you want to do when you were my age?" he suddenly asked. I looked at him and smiled. Oh, it was a kaleidoscope of dreams. Architecture, fashion design, even opening my own cafe. But then I met Ryan, and we decided his career would take priority. "And if things had gone differently, what would you have chosen?" His voice was calm, but there was a quiet persistence in it. "Probably design. I still love imagining how things could look. Colors, shapes, lines. It brings me joy." Eli nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing. The moment lingered between us as we caught up with Ryan. The walk ended at a cafe, where we had coffee. Out of nowhere, Ryan announced he needed to stop by a friend's house. His urgent errands always sounded like excuses. He apologized, quickly said goodbye, and left, leaving me and Eli alone. "Shall we keep walking?" Eli suggested. "I feel like we haven't reached the best part yet." I agreed without hesitation. We headed toward the riverfront, where sunlight danced on the water's surface. We walked slowly, talking about everything and nothing. "Have you ever felt like you're living someone else's life?" he asked suddenly. I stopped and looked at him. His question hit a nerve. "Sometimes it feels like everything is going as it should, and that's fine," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But at the same time, there's a yearning, as if I left a part of myself somewhere and can't find it anymore." He laughed quietly. "Sounds like regret." "Maybe. And you? Do you regret anything?" I turned to him, noticing how his gaze dropped to his shoes. "Of course. I think regret is what makes us human. But sometimes it's just an excuse to avoid changing things." His words resonated deeply. I turned away to hide my unease. The riverfront seemed endless. The sun warmed my shoulders, but inside, something felt cold. I thought about Ryan, our life, and how many years I had spent convincing myself that stability was all I needed for happiness. We reached an old staircase leading down to a quiet spot by the water. I sat on the steps, staring at the ripples. Eli sat beside me, his hands resting on his knees. "If you could go back, what would you change?" he asked. "Nothing," I lied. "I don't believe in fixing the past. It's a dangerous game." He smirked and gave me a faintly challenging look. "Liar. You'd change a lot." I turned to him, ready to argue, but he was watching me, too closely, too intently, as though he could see everything I tried to hide, even from myself. Something shifted in that moment. It was an impulse, unconscious, careless. He leaned in slightly, and I didn't pull away. His lips brushed mine, brief, soft, as if testing the boundaries. Time seemed to freeze. I wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. When I pulled back, I saw a mix of surprise and embarrassment in his eyes. He was the first to speak, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry. That was wrong." I nodded, trying to regain control. It was just a moment. Let's forget it." He nodded, and we stood up, as if on cue. The rest of the walk home was silent, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore now. It settled deep inside, pulling me into a whirlwind of questions I didn't want to answer. In the evening, I heard Ryan quietly close the door to his office. That sound always meant he had finished work and was ready to switch to us, to family life. I was cooking dinner, stirring a thick sauce in the pot. Eli sat at the table, staring at his phone. He acted carefree, but I could feel his gaze, sideways, furtive, as if checking whether I had noticed. Ryan walked into the kitchen and leaned against the doorframe. His posture was relaxed, but his face betrayed exhaustion. He looked at me a moment longer than usual, and I found myself wondering what had prompted it. "How was your day?" he asked, not taking his eyes off me. "Normal," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "And yours?" He turned to Eli. What did you spend the day on? Eli looked up and smirked, as if the question were some kind of subtle challenge. We went for a walk, worked a little on the project, nothing special. I felt the tension between them becoming palpable. Ryan frowned slightly, but said nothing. It wasn't like him. He usually avoided confrontation, preferring to let things take their course. But now there was something new in his gaze. Suspicion. Later, at dinner, he unexpectedly shifted the conversation to me. You look tired, Celeste. Is something wrong? I looked up, caught off guard by his attention. He rarely asked such questions. Everything's fine, just a bit worn out. You know how it is. Maybe we should go somewhere for the weekend? He suggested. Just the two of us. Relax. Recharge. It sounded so out of place that I hesitated to answer. Ryan wasn't the kind of person to suggest things like that. His initiatives were usually limited to work or formal gatherings, but there was something more in his proposal now, as if he was trying to regain control over something he was beginning to lose. Sure, I agreed, not knowing what else to say. He looked at me intently, as if searching for validation of his decision, but his eyes were full of doubt. That night, while I was cleaning up the dishes, something strange happened. I was taking off my ring to wash the sink, and it unexpectedly slipped from my finger. The metal clinked against the ceramic surface and disappeared down the drain. The sound made me freeze. My heart stopped with it. I dropped to my knees, pulling a toolbox from under the sink. A scraper, rubber gloves, and a bit of desperation. The light from the lamp fell directly into the sink, emphasizing the magnitude of this minor tragedy. Getting the ring back proved harder than I thought. My hands trembled, and the water in the pipes seemed to mock me, slipping away with the ring. With each failed attempt, panic grew inside me. It was just a simple object, but I knew it meant so much more to me. That ring was part of the promises I had made to myself and Ryan. Losing it felt ominously symbolic. Eli appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking inside and quietly asking, "Is everything okay?" I hadn't even noticed him approach. His voice was soft, without a trace of judgment. That unexpectedly touched me. I dropped my ring, I said, trying to sound neutral. I'm trying to get it out. He crouched beside me without saying a word. His presence was so vivid that even the smallest sounds, his breathing, the rustle of his clothes, felt deafening. He reached out and effortlessly pulled the ring from the drainpipe. Here, he said, smiling. Sometimes all you need is a fresh perspective. I took the ring and looked at him. His fingers lingered on my palm a moment longer than necessary. I quickly pulled my hand back and clutched the ring as if it might vanish again. When Ryan returned to the kitchen, Eli was already gone. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around me, something he hadn't done in a long time. I felt his warmth, but it was strange. It didn't comfort me. It only reminded me how long it had been since I had felt it. We'll be okay, right? He asked suddenly. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it I hadn't heard before. Doubt. Insecurity. Of course, I replied, trying to make my voice sound confident. But I wasn't sure anymore. The ring was back, but the feeling that I was losing something remained. Ryan's country house had always felt foreign to me. Spacious, with large windows that flooded every room with sunlight, it should have been inviting. Yet instead of warmth, it seemed to breathe emptiness. There was none of the coziness of our home in the city, only order and sterility, the hallmarks of my husband's preferences. I knew the house was a reminder of his past, of his first family, but Ryan never spoke about it. Here, it felt like we were playing roles. He, the perfect host. I, the dutiful wife. After a late breakfast, Ryan announced he was heading into the city for some errands. He mentioned a meeting, but the details didn't interest me. That left Eli and me alone. I suggested we take a walk to clear our heads. He agreed, a little lazily, with the casual ease that always left me feeling slightly more on edge. We followed an old trail that led to the lake. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. Eli walked a few steps ahead, but stopped abruptly and turned to me. "You know, I've never understood why he keeps this house," he said, gesturing toward the treetops where the roof of the estate was visible. "He hates clinging to memories of the past." I slowed my steps, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" I asked. Eli shrugged, but his expression turned serious. "This house mattered to my mom. She spent some of the best years of her life here. Ryan bought it for her to show how much he cared. But then he stopped coming. It became her prison, a place where she tried to hold together a family that was already falling apart. After the divorce, he kept the house. Since then, he hasn't really lived in it, just uses it for meetings and trips. What do you think that says?" I said nothing, unsure how to respond. His words struck a painful chord with my own understanding of Ryan. To me, he had always been practical, focused on comfort and efficiency. But in Eli's story, I saw something else: indifference, bordering on cruelty. "Your mother? How did she handle it?" I asked quietly. Eli gave a bitter smile. "She didn't. She broke. For her, Ryan was everything, but he just faded away. Gradually, she tried to fight, but it was a battle she couldn't win." A cold sensation spread through me. The image of Ryan as confident and logical began to fracture. I recalled how often he had been distant, avoiding difficult conversations in favor of burying himself in work. Was I already on the same path? We reached the lake and stopped at an old dock. The water was still, its surface reflecting the towering pines reaching for the sky. Eli sat at the edge and looked at me. "Celeste, you feel it too, don't you? Something's slipping away." I didn't answer. His words struck a chord, but I was too afraid to admit it, even to myself. "It's not my place," he continued, "but I saw it with my mom. You deserve something more, something real." I turned away, not wanting him to see how much those words hurt. They tore me apart. They were so right and so dangerous at the same time. When we returned, Ryan was already home. He was standing in the living room by the fireplace. His face was calm, but his eyes were tense. "You were gone a long time," he said, his tone almost accusatory. His words cut through the air. "Yes, we decided to walk to the lake," I replied, trying to sound natural. But Ryan stepped closer, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Jealousy. It was so uncharacteristic that I didn't know how to react. "Celeste, can we talk?" His voice was sharp. Eli, sensing the tension, excused himself and went upstairs, leaving us alone. Ryan turned to me, and I knew this wouldn't be an easy conversation. "What's going on?" he asked. "You've been avoiding me. You don't even look me in the eye anymore." I wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in my throat. "We didn't used to be like this," he continued. "I don't understand what I've done wrong." His voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw his anger give way to pain. But instead of feeling sympathy, I felt irritation. Why was he asking now, when things had already gone so far? Why hadn't he noticed earlier? "Nothing. Everything's fine," I said, knowing how hollow it sounded. He shook his head and walked over to the window. "I don't know what's happening, but this isn't what I wanted." I had no response. Instead, I looked at my reflection in the glass, thinking about how far I had strayed from the life I once thought was perfect. The morning began unnaturally quiet. The usual household noise was absent, replaced only by the occasional creak of floorboards underfoot. I was brewing coffee, listening to the drops falling into the glass carafe, filling the kitchen with a faint aroma. When I brought the mugs to the living room, Eli and Ryan were already sitting across from each other. The silence between them was so thick it felt tangible. "You should have done this yesterday," Eli began, breaking the stillness. His voice was calm, but there was a note of challenge in it. Done what? Ryan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His tone was defensive, even irritated. Talk to the lawyer about the house, Eli replied, nodding toward the papers on the table. You can't keep holding on to it just to watch it fall apart. Ryan exhaled sharply. His face tensed, and I realized the conversation had wandered into dangerous territory. You don't know what you're talking about, he shot back, glaring at his son. This isn't your house. You're just a guest here. Those words landed coldly, as if Ryan wanted to push him away intentionally, but Eli didn't back down. Not my house? He smirked, leaning forward. Are you serious? This was my mother's house. You took it, just like you took everything else. I froze. Those words seemed to cut through the fragile layer of tension that Ryan had been trying to maintain. His face paled, and his hands clenched into fists. Your mother, Ryan began, but he stopped. He stared at Eli as though replaying countless responses in his head, but unable to pick the right one. We parted ways by mutual agreement. You know that. Mutual agreement? Eli stood from his seat. You just left her the moment you realized she didn't fit into your plans. And now you sit here in a house that reminds me of how you destroyed her. I felt the air between them grow heavier. Ryan also stood, and now they faced each other like adversaries. Their faces were so close, I feared they might erupt. Enough, I said, stepping between them. Neither of you can talk without blaming the other. This is pointless. Ryan looked at me, his gaze filled with both gratitude and irritation. I'm not going to be part of this farce, he snapped, grabbing his keys off the table. I'm heading into town. When I get back, I hope you've calmed down. He left, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house. I heard the car start and quickly disappear into the distance. Left alone with Eli, I felt the tension ease slightly, only to give way to something else. More complex, deeper. He sat down on the couch, staring at his hands. Sorry, he said, not looking up. I didn't mean for it to turn into a fight. I sat beside him, holding my coffee mug with both hands. The warmth of the mug was strangely comforting. You just said what you felt, I replied. But Ryan, he doesn't know how to handle that. Eli nodded, but his face remained tense. Sometimes I think he still lives in his own world, where no one else matters. I stayed silent. Eli's words resonated within me, echoing my own thoughts. Ryan often seemed distant, as though he existed in a separate reality where I wasn't invited. We fell quiet, and I felt the air between us shift again. This wasn't the kind of silence that weighed heavily, but one filled with tense anticipation. Eli looked up and met my gaze. His eyes were full of contradictions, guilt, pain, and something I couldn't quite define. Do you know why I came back here? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Why? My voice was quieter than I expected. Because you're here, he said. His voice was so sincere, it felt like something inside me broke. He moved closer, his hand lightly brushing mine. I wanted to say something, but no words came. The moment, filled with silence and electricity, felt endless. He leaned in, his lips brushing mine, gently, as if asking permission. I didn't pull away. This time, it was different. It wasn't just an impulsive act, but a moment built on weeks of tension, unspoken words, and unacknowledged feelings. When I finally pulled back, my hands were still trembling. I looked at him, but his eyes held no regret. Only a silent question I wasn't yet ready to answer. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary. Here, I felt calmer than anywhere else in the house. But tonight, the walls seemed to be closing in. The light above the table cast warm yellow hues, but they didn't feel comforting. My hands moved mechanically, slicing vegetables, while my thoughts swirled like leaves caught in the wind. Ryan still hadn't returned, and the house was wrapped in an eerie silence. Eli entered the kitchen so quietly, I only noticed him when he stood beside me. He didn't say a word, just picked up a knife and started helping. His movements were slow and steady, as if he'd done this many times before. His presence should have reassured me, but instead, it only amplified the tension. We worked in silence, but it was a silence too loud to ignore. "Do you always cook with such care?" he finally asked, a corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the cutting board. "It helps me focus. When you cook, you don't have to think." "Don't think about what?" His voice was soft, but I knew he wouldn't settle for a vague answer. "Anything," I murmured, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. He always knew when I was trying to avoid the conversation. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," he said quietly. "You don't have to." I stopped, setting the knife down on the counter. His words hit me straight in the heart. He spoke so simply, yet each word struck with precision. "Sometimes it feels like I don't have a choice," I admitted, not meeting his eyes. "Ryan has his way of doing things. I've gotten used to keeping everything together. And if it all falls apart?" He carefully set his own knife down and rested a hand on the counter, a little closer to me. "Maybe it's meant to fall apart," he said. The words hung in the air, sending a shiver through me. They were terrifying and liberating all at once. I looked at him, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like ages. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. "You don't understand how hard it is," I whispered. "I can't just—" "You can," he interrupted. "You're just scared." He stepped closer, and now less than a meter separated us. I could feel his warmth, hear his breathing. In that moment, everything else seemed to fade away. No sounds, no time, no thoughts. "Why are you saying this to me?" I asked. "Because I want you to stop lying to yourself," he said, his voice quieter, but even more resolute. "You give so much, but you get less than you deserve in return." Those words broke the last of my defenses. I felt tears welling up, but forced myself to hold them back. I couldn't let myself break, not now. Eli lifted his hand, brushing my cheek gently. The touch was so delicate, it felt almost unreal. "You're not alone in this, Celeste," he said, and I knew I couldn't resist anymore. His lips met mine, softly, but with certainty. It wasn't like the first time, not impulsive or unexpected. This was deliberate, a moment we both knew we couldn't ignore. My hand instinctively reached for his shoulder, as if seeking stability. But then the silence shattered. Ryan's phone, left on the kitchen counter, buzzed loudly, breaking the spell. We pulled apart so abruptly that the sound of a knife falling from the edge of the counter echoed through the room. I glanced at the screen. "Ryan!" My heart pounded so fiercely, it felt like even Eli could hear it. Hastily, I grabbed the phone and answered. "Yes?" I said, trying to sound composed. "I'll be delayed for a couple more hours." Ryan's voice was calm as always. "Everything okay at home?" "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, feeling cold sweat trickling down my back. "All right. I'll call you later." When I ended the call, Eli was still standing there, watching me with a mix of regret and something else I couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," I whispered, unsure of what else to say. "Don't apologize," he said. "It's already happened." His words carried the weight of an undeniable truth. I knew this moment had changed everything, and there was no way back. The evening was drawing to a close, and the familiar silence once again settled over the house. I stood by the living room window, gazing at the pink-tinged sky. It felt as though the events of the past few days had pulled me in different directions, turning reality into a tangled mess of emotions, doubts, and desires. I didn't know how to unravel it, or if I even should. Eli entered the room, holding a glass of water. His presence was no longer light and casual, as it had been before. It had grown oppressive, weighed down by the unspoken truth I could no longer ignore. He stood beside me, his gaze fixed on me. His face was tense, as if he were about to say something important. "You're tired of all this, aren't you?" he asked. "I'm tired of myself," I replied honestly. the words slipping from my lips of their own accord. He nodded, as though he understood what I meant. His expression was serious, his eyes reflecting a strange mix of guilt and determination. He took a step closer, but before he could speak, we heard the sound of an engine. Ryan's car. I froze. His early return felt as unexpected as a cold shower. My heart began to race. Eli took a step back, as if trying to create distance between us. The door slammed, and I heard Ryan's footsteps in the hallway. My instinct told me to go and meet him, but I couldn't move. When he entered, his eyes immediately fell on us. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous undertone to it. "Nothing," I replied too quickly. The words sounded far too unconvincing to be taken as the truth. Ryan looked at me, then at Eli. His eyes narrowed and his jaw tightened. He stepped forward, and I realized I could no longer control the situation. "I knew you were looking for someone else," he said quietly, but every word cut like a knife. "I just didn't think it would be my son." His words hit me like an avalanche. My legs felt weak. The room suddenly became too hot, too stifling. I opened my mouth to say something, but no sound came out. This wasn't just anger, it was a raw wound, laid bare for both of us to see. "Ryan, it's not what you think," I began, but even I didn't believe the words. "Not what I think?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I'm not blind, Celeste. I saw the way you look at him. And you, Eli, you think you can just come back to this house and destroy everything I've built?" Eli raised his hands, trying to calm his father. "Dad, it's not what you think. It got out of control. I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Ryan stepped forward, his voice rising. "You don't even understand what you're saying. You've always been a problem, and now you—" "Stop it," I interrupted, feeling desperation mounting. "We've all gone too far. This isn't his fault, Ryan, it's mine." My words hung in the air, and I saw Ryan's face change. His anger gave way to something deeper. Disappointment. He looked as though I had shattered him completely. "You?" he whispered, his voice weak. I knew we were drifting apart, but this— I wanted to say something, but Eli cut me off. "I'll leave," he said. "This is wrong. I didn't mean for it to go this far." He turned to Ryan, but Ryan wasn't looking at him anymore. Instead, he stared at the floor, as if searching for answers that weren't there. "Go," Ryan said quietly. "Just go." Eli didn't argue. He looked at me one last time, and in his eyes, I saw everything: regret, pain, and something I couldn't quite define. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Ryan didn't say another word. He stood there, motionless, until I finally mustered the courage to leave the room, leaving him alone. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt as if the whole house could hear it. I knew this moment would mark the beginning of the end. I sat on the edge of the bed in our bedroom, surrounded by silence. A suitcase stood nearby, half filled with my belongings. How many times over the years had I opened that suitcase? For trips, visits to relatives, vacations? But never had I done so with the thought that I was leaving for good. The room around me felt unfamiliar, though I knew every corner of it. The soft cream curtains we had chosen together, the dark wooden dresser filled with memories. But now it was all just a backdrop to a life I could no longer call my own. Ryan had left for work without saying goodbye. His gaze that morning was distant, almost vacant. We hadn't spoken since what happened the night before. He had simply left, silently gathering his things and walking out, leaving me alone with my decision. Eli was gone too. He had left the previous night, leaving behind silence and an odd sense of relief. He had made the right choice, and I knew it was necessary. Yet part of me still felt the void where that brief, strange connection had been. I opened a drawer in the dresser to retrieve the last of my things and stumbled upon something I hadn't seen in years. A small note folded in half. I immediately recognized Ryan's handwriting. Neat, precise, always a bit formal. Your smile is what keeps me in this world. Those words had been written years ago, at the very beginning of our marriage. I remembered the moment clearly. It had been after our first serious argument, when I had broken down in tears, saying I felt unimportant. He had left that note on my mirror as an apology. I held it in my hands, feeling my heart constrict with memories. We had truly loved each other once. I couldn't deny that. But that love had turned into something else, something that could no longer hold us together. The words on the paper were a reminder of how it had all started, but they could no longer change what was now. I placed the note back in the drawer and closed it. That wasn't my baggage. Those memories belonged to a time that no longer existed. When I stepped out of the house, a light breeze brushed against my face. The world felt oddly calm, as if nothing had happened. I glanced at the house one last time. It had been a part of my life, but now it was a cage I had finally escaped from. I didn't know where I was going. I had no clear plan, only the desire to find something new, something of my own. I hailed a taxi and asked to be taken to the city center. There, amidst the noise and the people, I could breathe more freely. I stopped at a small cafe on the corner. It was almost empty, save for a few patrons. I ordered a cappuccino and pulled a book from my bag. Its pages smelled of fresh ink, and for some reason, that was comforting. Immersed in reading, I barely noticed when someone approached my table. A man's voice asked, "Is this seat taken?" I looked up. It was a stranger, with a gentle smile and a gaze that felt unexpectedly warm. I nodded, feeling something stir within me, a faint glimmer of something new, something hopeful. A feeling that everything was just beginning,